They were told one plane could sink one ship. They were told that enough planes, enough young men, enough willing sacrifices would sweep the American fleet from the Pacific forever. They were told their deaths would be beautiful, that their spirits would become cherry blossoms falling in spring, that their names would be remembered for 1,000 years. But something strange happened in those final months of the war. The pilots kept dying, the ships kept coming, and in the quiet moments between missions, in the letters they wrote home, in the diaries they hid beneath their mattresses, Japanese pilots began to whisper a truth that none dared speak aloud. The Americans were not stopping. They were not even slowing down. It was not the dying that broke them. It was the watching. It was seeing friend after friend climb into a plane loaded with explosives, wave goodbye with a smile that looked real from a distance, and disappear into the clouds toward an enemy fleet that seemed to multiply rather than shrink. The pilots who survived their first mission, their second mission, their third mission because of engine failure or bad weather or targets too well defended to approach, these men carried a burden heavier than any bomb. They had seen the truth from the sky. The American ships stretched across the ocean like a steel forest, and no matter how many planes dove into them, more ships came to take their place. The Kamikaze program began in desperation during the fall of 1944. Japan was losing the war. Everyone knew it, though few would say it. The great battles of Midway and the Philippine Sea had cost Japan most of its experienced pilots, the men who had trained for years to drop torpedoes with precision, to dogfight with skill, to return home alive for another mission. What remained were young men, some barely out of high school, with only enough training to take off, fly in one direction, and aim their planes at the largest object they could find. The mathematics were simple and terrible. One pilot, one plane, one bomb strapped to the body of an aircraft flying at full speed, impact, destruction, death. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the man who conceived the program, did not believe kamikaze attacks would win the war. This is the part most people never learn. Even he, the father of suicide attacks, understood that crashing planes into ships was not a winning strategy. It was a delaying tactic. It was meant to buy time, to make the American advance so costly in ships and sailors that perhaps, just perhaps, they would agree to negotiate rather than invade. Onishi wept when he proposed the plan. He knew he was asking young men to die for a hope, not a certainty. He knew the mathematics would eventually turn against them. There were only so many pilots. There were always more American ships. The pilots themselves understood this at different speeds. Some understood immediately. Some took weeks or months. Some never understood at all, dying with complete faith in their mission. But those who flew multiple times, who returned again and again because fate would not let them die, these men accumulated a terrible knowledge. They counted the ships below. They watched the explosions their comrades made against the steel hulls. And they watched the damaged ships sail away, still floating, still fighting, still very much afloat. A young pilot named Ichizo Hayashi wrote to his mother in April 1945. He was 23 years old, a graduate of Kyoto Imperial University, a man who had studied economics and dreamed of becoming a professor. Instead, he sat in a barracks in Kyushu, waiting for the order that would send him to his death. His letter was not heroic. It was not filled with glory or the poetry of sacrifice. He wrote simply that he would do his duty because his country asked him to do it. But between the lines, in the words he chose and the words he avoided, there was something else. There was resignation without hope. He did not write about victory. He did not write about turning the tide. He wrote about dying because that was all that remained to be done. The smell of those airfields in the final year of the war was a mixture of things no one would want to remember. Aviation fuel, thick and heavy in the tropical air, the sweat of young men who had not bathed in days, the salt of the nearby ocean, the faint sweetness of sake, drunk the night before a mission to calm nerves that would not be calmed, and beneath it all, the metallic scent of the planes themselves, the Zeros and the older aircraft pressed back into service, machines that groaned and leaked and sometimes refused to start at all. This was not the gleaming Air Force of 1941. This was an army of ghosts flying in coffins. The training was brief because there was no time. There was no fuel for extended practice. There was no need to teach advanced maneuvers to men who would never need to turn around. They learned to take off. They learned to navigate by the stars and the Sunday. They learned to pick out the shape of an aircraft carrier from among the destroyers and cruisers that surrounded it. And they learned to dive. That was all. The art of combat flying, the skills that took years to develop, none of this mattered anymore. All that mattered was the final 30 seconds, the screaming descent through anti-aircraft fire, the attempt to strike something vital before the bullets or the flames took you. What they saw in those final seconds haunted the men who survived to describe it. The American ships threw up walls of fire, hundreds of guns on dozens of ships, all firing at once, creating a net of explosions and tracers that seemed impossible to penetrate. The new American proximity fuses, shells that exploded when they sensed an aircraft nearby rather than requiring a direct hit, transformed the sky into a killing zone. Pilots watched their wingmen dissolve into fireballs hundreds of yards from the nearest ship. They watched planes spiral down into the ocean, missing their targets entirely. They watched explosion after explosion against the sides of American carriers. And then they watched those carriers sail on, damaged but not sinking, not stopping, not dying. It was not the fear that surprised them, it was the mathematics. A pilot named Ryuji Nagatsuka survived the war because his missions kept being canceled. Weather, mechanical failure, orders changed at the last moment. He flew with his comrades to the gathering point again and again, said goodbye to men who would not return, and then found himself back at the base, alive, waiting for the next attempt. In his memoirs, he described the slow erosion of belief that came with each return. At first, he felt only shame. He had failed to die. His friends had succeeded, had become heroes, had joined their ancestors. He was still alive, still eating, still breathing, still waiting. But as the weeks passed, as the reports came in, as the truth became impossible to ignore, the shame turned into something else. It turned into doubt. The American fleet was enormous. This was the fact that propaganda could not erase. Japanese newspapers wrote of great victories, of dozens of carriers sunk, of the enemy reeling in terror from the fury of the divine wind. But the pilots could count. They could see. They flew over that fleet, and they knew that no number of planes, no amount of courage, no sacrifice, however pure, could sweep that steel forest from the sea. The Americans built ships faster than Japan could train pilots to crash into them. This was the equation that could not be solved. This was the truth that no one would speak. The mechanics who prepared the planes knew something was wrong. They worked through the night, patching holes in aircraft that should have been retired years ago, fitting bombs to frames that shuddered with every takeoff. They watched the pilots, boys really, sitting in the darkness before their missions, writing letters, drinking sake, some praying, some crying, some laughing at jokes that were not funny. The mechanics said little. What was there to say? They could not refuse to prepare the planes. They could not tell these boys that their deaths might mean nothing. They could only bow when the pilots climbed into the cockpits, wish them success, and watch them disappear into a sky that was hungry for their lives. In the mess halls, in the quiet hours, conversations happened that should not have happened. Whispered words between pilots who had returned too many times. Questions without answers. How many ships did we sink today? How many ships appeared the next day? Where are they coming from? Why do they not stop? These questions were dangerous. To question the mission was to question the emperor, to question Japan itself. And yet the questions came anyway, rising like steam from tea, impossible to contain. The answers never satisfied. The newspapers lied. Everyone knew the newspapers lied. But to say so was unthinkable. So the pilots nodded at reports of great victories and tried not to count the empty bunks. A strange ritual developed among the men. They would write 2 letters before each mission. The first was for the censors, for the official record, filled with proper sentiments about honor and sacrifice and the glory of dying for the emperor. This letter would be saved, perhaps published, perhaps read at ceremonies honoring the noble dead. The second letter was hidden, slipped to a trusted friend, buried in personal belongings, sometimes burned immediately after being written. These letters told the truth. They spoke of fear. They spoke of doubt. They spoke of love for mothers and sisters and girls they would never marry. They spoke of a longing to live that no amount of training could erase. Some pilots prayed, not to the emperor, not to the gods of the state religion, but to ancestors, to Buddha, to anyone who might be listening in the darkness. They asked for courage, not because they wanted to die, but because dying well was all they had left. They asked for forgiveness, for the doubts they could not silence, for the questions they could not stop asking. They asked to be remembered, not as heroes, but as men who did their best in an impossible situation. These prayers were never recorded in official histories. They existed only in the silence between heartbeats, in the moments before sleep, in the long walks to the aircraft before dawn. The commanding officers faced their own crisis of faith. Many had been pilots themselves, had flown in the great battles of the early war, had survived through skill and luck and circumstances beyond their control. Now they sent young men to certain death, knowing that each death bought only a few more hours, a few more days, a slight delay in an outcome that could not be changed. Some officers drank heavily. Some became rigid and formal, hiding their emotions behind protocol and ceremony. Some grew gentle, spending their final evenings with the pilots, listening to their stories, learning their names, carrying the weight of memory that these young men would never get to build. Lieutenant Yukio Seki led the first official kamikaze mission in October 1944. Before he flew, a journalist asked him what he thought about his sacrifice. Seki did not speak of glory. He did not speak of honor. He said only that he was not dying for the emperor or for Japan. He was dying because he was ordered to die, because his death might protect the people he loved, his young wife, his family. And then he said something remarkable. He said that Japan was doomed. He said that forcing young men to crash into ships, wasting their lives and their planes, was proof that the war was already lost. Then he flew his mission and did not return. The American sailors who survived the attacks remembered the sound most of all. The roar of engines pushed beyond their limits, the high-pitched scream of a plane in its final dive, the thunder of guns, their own guns, guns from every ship in the formation, all firing at once in a desperate attempt to stop what was coming. And then the impact. Sometimes a splash, a missed target spinning into the waves. Sometimes a boom, metal against metal, fire spreading across the deck, men screaming, damage control teams rushing to save their ship. The American ships could take terrible punishment. This was what the Japanese pilots discovered. They were designed to survive, with damage control systems, with firefighting equipment, with crews trained to save their vessels no matter what hit them. The carriers were the hardest targets. They were fast and well defended. The destroyers on the outer ring of the fleet existed precisely to intercept threats before they could reach the carriers. A kamikaze plane had to pass through miles of concentrated fire, through fighters launched to intercept, through the wall of anti-aircraft shells, through all of this before it could even attempt to hit its target. And even if it hit, even if the pilot achieved his final goal, the carrier often survived, damaged, bleeding smoke, listing slightly, but afloat, still launching planes, still fighting, still very much alive. It was not the dying that broke them, it was the futility. By the spring of 1945, the fuel was running out. The planes were running out. The pilots were running out. Japan scraped the bottom of its resources, sending up aircraft that could barely fly, piloted by men who had barely been trained, loaded with bombs that were increasingly small because larger bombs were no longer available. The missions became shorter, not because the enemy had retreated, but because the planes could not fly far enough to reach them. The divine wind was dying, not in glory, but in a slow strangling of supplies. Some pilots refused. This is the part of the story that is rarely told. Not all kamikaze volunteers were volunteers. Not all believers remained believers. In the chaos of those final months, in the confusion of overlapping orders and collapsing authority, some men said no. They could not speak this refusal aloud. They could not announce their defiance, but they found ways. Mechanical problems that were perhaps not entirely accidents. Navigation errors that led them away from the fleet. Missions aborted for reasons that could not be questioned. These men lived with the knowledge that their survival came at the price of their comrades' deaths, that someone else would fly in their place. It was not an easy survival, but it was survival. The Emperor recorded his surrender speech on the 15th of August 1945. When pilots heard his voice, many wept. Not from grief, though grief was present. Not from relief, though relief was present too. They wept because the voice was human. For years they had been taught that the Emperor was a god, a divine being whose wishes shaped the universe. Now they heard him speak, in a high and formal voice, using words they could barely understand because the court language was so different from their own. He was a man, just a man, and they had been asked to die for a man. In the days after the surrender, pilots wandered their bases like ghosts. They had been prepared to die. They had accepted death, had made peace with it, had written their final letters and said their final prayers. Now they had to live. For some, this was impossible. Onishi, the admiral who had created the kamikaze program, took his own life, leaving a note of apology to the young men he had sent to their deaths. Others followed him, unable to accept a world in which their sacrifices meant nothing, in which Japan lay in ruins despite everything they had given. But most lived. They put away their flight suits. They burned their undelivered letters. They went home to families who could not understand what they had experienced. They took jobs, married, had children. They built the new Japan that rose from the ashes of the old. And they rarely spoke of what they had seen, what they had done, what they had believed in those terrible final months. The memories were too heavy. The truth was too complicated. The shame and the pride were too tangled together to separate. Decades later, in interviews conducted by historians who promised to listen without judgment, some of these men finally spoke. They described the fear. They described the doubt. They described the slow erosion of belief that came from watching ship after ship after ship emerge from the horizon, an endless parade of steel and fire that no amount of sacrifice could stop. They described the moment when they understood, truly understood, that they were dying not to win but to delay, not for victory but for a negotiated peace that never came. And they described the strange peace that came after understanding, the acceptance of death not as glory but as duty, not as triumph but as the only choice remaining in a war that should never have been fought. It was not the dying that broke them, it was the knowing. The kamikaze pilots of World War II have become symbols of fanaticism in Western memory, examples of a culture so different from our own that it could produce men willing to die on command. But this is not the whole truth. These were young men, many of them educated, many of them thoughtful, many of them deeply uncertain about what they were being asked to do. They flew because they loved their families and wanted to protect them. They flew because refusal meant shame and possibly death. They flew because they had been taught from birth that duty to nation and emperor was the highest virtue. And when they saw the truth from the sky, when they understood that their deaths would not stop the American fleet, they flew anyway, not because they believed in victory, but because there was nothing else left to do. The ships kept coming. This was the lesson written in fire and blood across the Pacific in those final months. No matter how many planes dove into them, no matter how many young men gave their lives, the ships kept coming. America's industrial power was simply too vast, its ability to replace losses too efficient, its technology too advanced. The divine wind met the steel forest, and the steel forest won. Not through courage, not through honor, but through logistics and production and the cold mathematics of modern war. And yet something remains from those desperate months. Not glory, not triumph, but a reminder of what happens when nations demand the ultimate sacrifice from their young, a reminder that faith in a cause does not make that cause just, a reminder that the men who fight wars on all sides are human beings first and soldiers second, carrying doubts and fears and questions that no amount of training can erase. The kamikaze pilots deserve to be remembered, not as fanatics, not as heroes, but as young men caught in the machinery of a war they could not stop and a faith they could not fully believe. The letters they wrote home are still preserved in museums across Japan. Some are formal and proper, filled with the expected words of honor and sacrifice. Others are heartbreaking in their simplicity. One pilot wrote only that he wanted to see the cherry blossoms one more time. Another wrote that he hoped his mother would not cry for too long. Another wrote that he was not afraid of dying, only of dying without meaning. These were not gods. These were not demons. These were boys who wanted to live, who were told they had to die, and who faced that death with a complexity of emotion that no simple story can capture. The ships kept coming, and the pilots kept flying, and somewhere in the space between propaganda and reality, between duty and doubt, between the last letter home and the final dive toward the sea, the truth lived. It lives still, waiting in the archives, waiting in the memories of those few survivors who remained silent for decades before finally speaking, waiting for those who are willing to listen without judgment, to understand without excusing, to remember without forgetting the terrible cost of war. There were thousands of stories like this one, lives cut short or changed forever in those desperate final months, voices that deserve to be heard after years of silence. If you want to remember them with us, join us as we continue to uncover the untold moments of history.